This is the Tristan Law Show. If it's your first time here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. I'm Tristan Law, semi-retired pro wrestler, and today, I'm your host. Let's think about something for a second. What if Vince McMahon lost? What if WCW actually won the Monday Night Wars, and maybe what if they bought WWE? Well, there could have been lost careers, shifting styles, the fall of Vince McMahon, and possibly the death of sports entertainment. Look, pop culture wouldn't have embraced WCW. They gave us RoboCop, not WrestleMania moments. But strap in, because we're going to dive into the timeline that could have possibly ruined pro wrestling as you know it. If it's your first time here, just want to remind you that we are fully interactive, whether we are live or on demand. So make sure that you put your messages in the chat, and I personally respond to every single message. So, in case you're a brand new wrestling fan and you don't know what the Monday Night Wars was, let's just do a quick recap just to catch you up. So the Monday Night Wars was a ratings battle between WWF's Monday Night Raw and WCW's Nitro. And they were airing head-to-head on Monday nights during the late 90s. Let me tell you, it was a great time to be a pro wrestling fan. WCW Nitro premiered September 4th, 1995, and they went directly head-to-head with Vince McMahon and WWF Raw. But look, from 1996 to 1998, WCW, they dominated. And you know what? That was all thanks to the NWO. Because you know, once you're NWO, you're NWO for life. WCW embraced that reality-based storytelling, and they used surprise debuts like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. WCW Nitro beat WWF Raw. For 83 straight weeks, they beat the brakes off of them. But then WWF started fighting back. From 1998 to 2001, they launched the Attitude Era. Edgy content, real characters, and major stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, DX, and The Undertaker. And you know what? We'll even throw in Kane and Mankind. They were the top stars in the WWE at the time, WWF at the time, okay? You had moments like Stone Cold Steve Austin and Vince McMahon's feud, which helped turn the tide. Now let's look at the turning point. WCW made a lot of mistakes. They were over-reliant on older stars like Hogan, Hall, maybe not Hall and Nash, but let's go with Hogan. Maybe Ric Flair. Ric Flair might have been like in his 40s, 50s at the time, but he was still the baddest player in the game. They had backstage chaos in WCW, and they had poor creative decisions. Speaking of poor creative decisions, they even had the finger poke of doom. But here's when WCW killed themselves. They gave away Mick Foley winning the WWE Championship on Nitro. Eric Bischoff said, "You don't want to watch Monday Night Raw because you want to stay here. Let me tell you what's happening on Monday Night Raw. That Mick Foley, Mankind, he's winning the WWF Championship, and nobody wants to see that." And you know what? That was wrong, because everybody switched the channel because we all wanted to see it. WWE officially won the war. And Vince McMahon bought WCW on March 23rd, 2001. The final episode of Nitro aired on March 26, 2001, and it was a simulcast with Raw. The legacy. It reshaped the pro wrestling industry forever. It spiked the rise of megastars and led to the WWE becoming, let's just face it, a giant monopoly. That was until AEW came along. So, we're setting the stage now. Now that you understand what the Attitude Era is, and you understand what happened, we called you up real quickly, we are going to go into the alternate timeline. In the alternate timeline, WCW wins and WWF loses. No WWE. The industry would look totally different today. Less fanfare, less mainstream, and maybe even forgotten. Go ahead and give me a subscribe if you like what I'm doing. Go ahead and subscribe. I love subscribes. They mean a lot. We got Jamal Stevens in the chat. He goes, you got to back before the kickstart of the Attitude Era. Look, man, we could only do so much. Could only do so much in the time limit that they allow us to be here. So, but that was just a very quick rehash of the Attitude Era for people that don't know. But thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you, brother. So WCW was already a sinking ship. Even if they won, look, they would have been in trouble. And they being WCW. WCW, they paid wrestlers a lot of money, and some of them, they even got paid to stay at home and never work. There's not one business that you know, anywhere in America, Canada, anywhere in the world, where they will pay you to sit at home and do nothing. But WCW did. Here's a hot take. WCW would have needed an entire internal overhaul because they were bleeding out. If they were going to buy the WWE because they won the Monday Night Wars, what WCW would have had to do, they would have had to figure it out. Because you know what? It wasn't working. Eric Bischoff's role, look, let's face it. Eric Bischoff, he wasn't the owner. He was an employee. Could Eric Bischoff had stepped in and saved WCW? We're going to look at that, so make sure you don't go anywhere. Look, AOL Time Warner, they were the ones that eventually bought. Some of you kids might not know what AOL is. AOL is the internet program back in the day that you used to get on the internet. And eventually they became a media company, and then they started buying up different things, and they eventually owned Turner Broadcasting, which was owned by Ted Turner. So I think that they would have still sold off WCW and WWF if they won, because why? AOL Time Warner felt like WCW didn't align with their vision, and it would be hard to gain advertisers. But how, Sway? How? WCW Thunder was their highest rated show on TBS. That's a wrestling show by WCW on the AOL Time Warner channel. Look, I just personally think, at the time, WCW just wanted to get out the wrestling business. But look, WWE in this timeline wouldn't have won because they were great. They won because they just had the momentum. That was it. They were just lucky. If you're hearing my voice and you can't see my face, you are probably listening to the audio-only version of the Tristan Law Show wherever you find a podcast. We are live Tuesdays and Fridays at noon here on YouTube. But if you're listening to this and you don't want to see my face, you can always catch the episodes new wherever you find a podcast 6 days later. There's a fallout if WWF, well then E, or became E, lost to WCW and WCW bought them. Vince McMahon would go from a mogul to a failure. Maybe he'd be in the poorhouse. Maybe he'd be disgraced. Maybe he wouldn't be the person that everybody would be talking about today. Maybe people in this day and age would still celebrate Vince McMahon. Look, I'll be honest. I celebrate Vince McMahon. I celebrate the contributions that he has made to pro wrestling. Anything he's done in his personal life, I'm going to let the court sort that out. That's not for me to sort out, and I'm not getting into that. But if Vince McMahon had lost WWF, there'd be no XFL. But let's say Vince McMahon did sell off WCW and he had a little bit of money. WWF, and he had a little bit of money. The XFL might have succeeded. Vince McMahon would have been able to put 1,000% behind the XFL. And it might have, it might have rivaled the NFL. Right now, not right now because we don't live in that reality, but in a whole separate reality, the XFL probably put the NFL out of business. It's a possibility. It was the alternative that everybody always wanted. What about Shane McMahon, his son? What about Stephanie? Gone? Linda and Vince? Retired or just ghosts? Let's take a look into that. I think that Linda and Vince McMahon, they probably would have sailed on. In case you don't know, Linda McMahon is a politician, and she was trying to become like Senator of Connecticut way back when, Moses was trying to part the Red Sea. But I think that she might have gotten to politics sooner. And maybe she would have been like a governor or something like that. Don't know. But there's so many different opportunities that she probably could have went into politics a couple years sooner, and it might have worked out with her because she wouldn't have had the stink of the WWE on her. I don't know. And I'm not saying that WWE stinks. I love it. That's why we're all here today. But looking at Vince McMahon, though, he's a visionary. And he would have only lost to WWE because he played a bad hand of poker. That's all it is. That's the only reason why Vince McMahon would have lost, is because he played a bad hand of poker. But in the real reality, he just played a better game than WCW. And I think that WCW became a little bit too cocky. I might talk about that later on. So, Shane McMahon, Vince's son, I wouldn't be surprised if he would have convinced his dad to buy UFC or some kind of MMA company, because right then in that time in 2001, MMA was becoming hot in America again. Stephanie McMahon, she had a degree in communications, or has a degree in communication. She would have moved on to something else. And let me tell you, Stephanie, she's smart. And I love listening to Stephanie talk. Stephanie McMahon would have prospered. Triple H, all right, we're going to name Triple H only because he's in the family. Okay, they wouldn't have gotten married in the timeline yet. All right, because they in this timeline, they got married in 2003. So if that's the case, they probably would have gotten married thereafter. Triple H might have gone back to WCW. Because in 2001, Triple H was just that damn good. But the BS in WCW might have swallowed him up. But imagine, in an alternate timeline, that WCW beat WWF, that Vince McMahon would be the one getting interviewed by Eric Bischoff. It's possible, 100% possible. What happens to the WWE's brand? Look, WWE would have built up a legacy by then. From all the way in the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s, until their demise in the 90s. WWF, there would have been too much money to scrap it, to just throw it away. But WCW might have been dumb enough to sell it. You see, in this timeline that we're in now, the reason why WCW really isn't celebrated, because WCW really didn't do much. They weren't WCW wasn't even around that long. Right now, as we are talking to each other live, if you're watching this episode on demand, by the time you're watching this episode, AEW Dynamite is only 2 episodes behind WCW Nitro. It felt like WCW was around for a long time in what we knew it, in what we know it as. But AEW Dynamite is only 2 weeks behind, if they have not passed WCW Nitro yet, on the same exact network. The history, though, of the WWF, of the brand, it's worth a lot. But I think that WCW is dumb enough they would have sold it off. And that's saying if they bought WWE, AOL Time Warner, they wanted to get out of the pro wrestling business, but we're assuming that they just bought them because you know what? Who else is going to buy it? We just want to buy it, take the library, maybe we do something with it. And what I think it would do is that if WCW, if AOL Time Warner was looking to get out of the wrestling business, if they had bought WWE, it would have only made WCW cost more because of the library alone. If somebody knew what to do with the library, WCW would have been worth tons of money. But you know what, though? WCW probably wouldn't have done that because AOL Time Warner was so dumb to let go of WCW for what they did. I think that AOL Time Warner let go of WCW, I think it was for $2 million. Like, I got to look that up real quick. Yeah, it was $2.5 million. WCW got sold for $2.5 million. Vince McMahon done made that money back. If WCW understood, if AOL Time Warner understood what the hell WCW was, they probably would have put a little bit of extra money on it, but they couldn't see it. They just wanted to get rid of it. And that's why I always say that somebody else's trash is another person's treasure. Vince always saw in this reality, he always saw the value in a tape library. Vince McMahon bought up as much pro wrestling library and intellectual properties as he could because he had the vision for the WWE network. He had the foundation. But in this alternate timeline where WCW beat WWF after 83 straight weeks of beating them like they stole something, would somebody else had been able to see the vision regarding the library? Would there have been DVDs released for the best of WWF? There would have had to been. Somebody would have been smart enough to buy it and to understand what you can do with it. If WCW survived and stayed in business, I don't think they'd even know what to do with the WWF library. You know why? Because WWF pretty much didn't know what to do with WCW itself. They took the library and put everything else to the side. They owned the intellectual property for everything else. But you know what? They own the library. Without that footage, though, there's no WWE network. We're just getting reruns of Thunder, WCW Saturday Night, and WCW Nitro. Do me a favor, you're still sticking around. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Subscribes mean a lot. Appreciate it. We are growing a lot here on the Tristan Law Show. We're up to 307 subscribers. So shout out to everybody that's here for the ride. I appreciate you because we are growing. So who would have survived going over to WCW from the WWF? I'm not going to sit here and name out everybody, but here are a couple names that I thought about when I was putting this whole entire idea together. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the Texas Rattlesnake. Mr. Austin 316 said, I just whipped your... That guy. I think he would have fell flat in WCW. Because Eric Bischoff didn't originally see anything in Stone Cold Steve Austin. That's why they allowed him to leave WCW. Austin, though, I don't think that he would have probably fit into the wrestling in WCW. He could have done it, but when Stone Cold Steve Austin was different, that's how I think he made his money. The Rock. I think that The Rock, that he probably would have worked because charisma always wins. I think The Rock would have prospered. However, I don't see him running around as Dwayne Johnson pretending to be The Rock. I don't think that it would have hit home for everybody. No. Who I think would have worked, though? The Undertaker. The American Badass fits right into the WCW's reality-based mold because that's what they were doing at the time. But WCW didn't see any money in The Undertaker. And if he was running around as Mean Mark, shrouded as the American Badass, I think it might have worked. Because just like I know, you can definitely see a biker running around calling himself Mean Mark. Look, it wouldn't have to be The Undertaker taking souls and whatever it may be. It could have just been a real badass biker. I think that would have worked for The Undertaker. Triple H? Maybe. No click backstage, no power. He would just be another guy in WCW. I think, though, that he would have flourished, but WCW didn't see any money in him originally. When you're looking at it, Jeff Hardy, the Cruiserweight, Edge, they probably wouldn't even get any entrance pyro. So it'll be just a waste of time for them. But look, it'd be a cultural shift because we wouldn't have sports entertainment or wrestling as we call it today. What we would have is that we would have wrestling. Why? Because sports entertainment would be DOA. Sports entertainment is something that WWE invented. They took the entertainment portion of pro wrestling, because there's always been entertainment in pro wrestling, and they blew it up to make pro wrestling feel more larger than life by focusing on the sports and the entertainment portion of it. And that's what Vince McMahon also did as well too, so that they wouldn't regulate wrestling like it's like boxing because it's a shoot sport. Yeah, we all know how that went. But I think that sports entertainment, that style of WWE wrestling, would be dead in its tracks. But not forever. Sports entertainment, the WWE style of wrestling, it would have been dead in the water 100%. But WWE wouldn't be able to know what to do to fill in that sports entertainment void because they gave us things like the RoboCop and the Shockmaster. WCW, it equals Southern wrestling. It was a tradition. WWE, WWF was ingrained into the bloodstream of people within the Northeast. Sports entertainment, though, would have been reborn somewhere else as something else. Because in this current timeline, the closure of WCW, it created a void. We got TNA, and then we eventually got AEW. But in the alternate timeline where WCW wins, due to the void of WWE being gone, there would have been something else. And you know what? I really think that it could have been spearheaded by somebody as smart as Triple H. Imagine from 2001 to 2025, today, we'd be getting ready for another Starrcade. And if you ask me, I don't think that Starrcade ever felt as big as WrestleMania. Northeast fans wouldn't have vibed with it. WWF fans wouldn't have vibed with it. They would have been gone. Maybe AEW would have turned into something that was more sports entertainment style. Because growing up in the Northeast, in New York to be exact, WCW was cool, man, but WCW wasn't it. It was nice to watch, but I want my WrestleMania. Like I always said, I feel that WrestleMania is always and has always been a bigger yearly event than Starrcade. Look, I'm giving myself a hand clap for that. Because in order for WCW to succeed in the Northeast, they would have had to march into Madison Square Garden as they've never done a show there before and reintroduce the fans to WCW. But you know what, though? Why it probably wouldn't have worked? Because it was wrestling. We were accustomed to watching sports entertainment. So they would have had to use some WWF guys or gals in there in order to make it work. But in all, WCW would have never kept pro wrestling mainstream unless they had the appropriate madman on their side. Vince McMahon. Look, if WCW had beaten WWF back in 2001, there'd be no big arenas. There'd be no tribute to the troops. And their pyro budget for Cena, there'd be none. I mean, there isn't much now, but there'd be none. Just leave me alone. Go ahead and make sure you hit that like button if you like what I'm talking about. So now we got a whole entire new generation of pro wrestling that would have had to eventually been born. The Cenas, the Randy Ortons, the Batistas. It's inevitable, but they would have been born into a bad system. Batista probably would have been booked as a monster, but he would have fizzled out. There'd be no Drax. There'd be no movie star Batista. The Performance Center would have been replaced by the WCW power plant if they were smart. But you know what? I don't think WCW weren't. WWF guys would have flooded the indies. I've wrestled and befriended people from WCW, like Crowbar. Very awesome guy. Nice guy. Can't say nothing but nice things about him. But WCW had too many people on their roster, and they could only absorb so many people. In an alternate timeline, I wrestled on a show with Triple H and Mick Foley. But you know what? Maybe in that alternate timeline, maybe I didn't want to be a wrestler because wrestling wasn't fun for me anymore. Maybe I would have went to go be a lawyer or a cop or something like this, and I'd be sitting in front of you on YouTube talking about law advice. I don't know. Tristan Law, lawyer, law. I don't know. I feel like it works. What I think, though, with the closure of WWF is that many people would have went international. So now when I say that, international wrestling might have blown up. They might have rebirthed the WWE as something else. They would have did sports entertainment internationally, and then it would have blew up and eventually probably came back to America. Because there would have been an influx of WWE guys and gals looking for work. Not everybody could have went to WCW. Look, if WCW had beaten WWF in 2001, you'd probably see WWE tribute shows on the indies. It's wild to think about that because it's a possibility. They do ECW shows on the indies. It's because you know what, you couldn't really, ECW was lightning in a bottle. You couldn't capture that again. It was a moment in time. It was a moment in time when everybody was being rebellious. ECW came along and decided to be rebellious. But what was WWE? WWF was a tradition. You always sat around to go ahead and watch the Survivor Series around Thanksgiving time. You always knew that in the early spring, what were you getting? You were getting WrestleMania. In the summer, you always looked forward to SummerSlam. It was just something that we just did here in the Northeast. If WCW had bought WWF back in 2001 because WWF had lost, there would have been technology and innovations that would have been missed. Look, Vince wanted the WWE network before streaming was a thing. He wanted radio. He had a cable channel. He was a forward thinker. But WCW, what they thought about today. WCW, they thought about tomorrow. WCW would have jumped on it. They would have eventually did streaming, but out of survival, not vision. Video was always already on the internet. Around that time, I remember being able to go to Yahoo and being able to watch music videos. Now, your young kids don't know about that. So streaming services behind a paywall, it was inevitable. It was going to eventually happen. Hopefully, somebody would have been smart enough to come out with a WCW network. Without WCW's footage, look, think about it like this. If WCW had bought WWF back in 2001 because WWF lost, without WWE's footage, there'd be no network, there'd be no Peacock deal, just Nitro marathons and Crackle. I'm glad that we are where we are. Because wrestling would have survived. But it might have been maybe as popular as curling. We would have probably never gotten an elimination chamber. But hey, Ready to Rumble? There might have been a sequel for Ready to Rumble. I like that movie. If WCW had been a fan, no, let me try again. If WCW had beat WWF back in 2001, the question now is, would you be a fan today? Make sure that you drop your comments here on YouTube. My name is Tristan Law, and this is the Tristan Law. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I did today, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Share this with a friend. Let them know what we did here. Make sure you put something in the comments because, look, I read and I respond to everything. Make sure you go watch some wrestling because I'll be back this Tuesday at noon here on YouTube. I think I'm going to watch some AEW Dynamite. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
Flashing red lights, driving at night, windowless ride, feeling alive, nothing in sight, forever in flight, follow those lines, we'll make it this time, blurry street lights, work as a